But just you wait until Warren finds out what his precious son tried to do to him. Hold on.
This is Channel 4. We now join the Channel 4 News.
It's the end. But the moment has been prepared for.
In fact, we were unusually prepared this time. I'd pictured the news of the Queen's royal decease roaring unexpectedly out of nowhere, like a jump cut in the fabric of reality, the way it had with her husband and daughter-in-law. Instead, we, and our broadcasters, had the whole afternoon to brace ourselves. This time it was bargain hunt that faded out at a quarter to noon.
Through the rain, through the damp.
But only for the news that the Queen was deathly ill.
Welcome to viewers on BBC One. We have had news from Buckingham Palace that the Queen is under medical supervision at Balmoral.
Although at this point she was in fact still alive and they hadn't got round to dressing everyone in black yet, the BBC probably knew more than they were letting on. Well, probably nothing. They definitely knew more than they were letting on. That's the whole point of Operation Unicorn. That's right, after all that talk of bridges, she went and died in Scotland. And there's a whole other protocol for that. After about an hour, it was serious enough to bring in Hugh Edwards, easily the BBC's top news man, the Sissons or Baker of our time. His deployment this early in the day was a clue. And so the news rolled on all afternoon, full of concern but bereft of any actual details. At least it did on the BBC. ITV hedged their bets at first as far as what would keep people watching. Being neither privy to the same insider information as the actual national broadcaster, nor beholden to the same formalities, they put out the usual lunchtime news, slightly extended, and eventually, because nothing was happening yet, went to Dickinson's Real Deal. Ironically, at around the time it was later revealed the Queen actually died. Meanwhile, the BBC cleared the decks altogether on BBC One and kept a beady eye on BBC Two. By mid-afternoon, the Queen was dead. We didn't know that yet, but the BBC did. Consequently, the coverage had become downright eerie, with Hugh and the increasingly cadaverous Nicholas Witchell dressed in black, constantly talking about eras ending and tectonic plates shifting, effectively obituarising even before the announcement, trying desperately and almost palpably not to mention death. By this point the conclusion was inescapable, that the BBC knew more than we did. The only light relief came with a weird bit where Hugh and Witchell squinted at people emerging from a plane in Aberdeen and tried to guess who they were.
Well, I'm sorry, I can't identify who that is.
I can't either.
Maybe an official or another policeman, though he was getting into the back of the car.
ITV soon got the point, and probably a message from the palace as well. And by 4:30, were rolling alongside the BBC, essentially filling dead air before the official announcement, in a mad sort of passive-aggressive last rites ceremony. Finally, the moment of truth came at 6:30. The moment everyone in the country has awaited like vultures for at least the past decade, if not more.
A few moments ago, Buckingham Palace announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. The Palace has just issued this statement. It says the Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon. The King and the Queen Consort will remain at Balmoral this evening and will return to London tomorrow.
Fortunately, given all the anticipation, no one messed up, although Mary Nightingale was momentarily let down by the voices in her head.
And I'm afraid to say in the last few moments, the following statement has been released. It reads, I will find that statement for you. The Queen died peacefully at Balmoral this afternoon.
It's so lonely on the limb. Hugh Edwards ended up reading that statement 3 times in 5 minutes, twice in a row because of its sheer importance, and one more time as a straight-up news flash, as BBC Two faded out from some athletics to join BBC One as the single BBC from London ingot, familiar from previous Alma syndrome outbreaks.
The BBC is interrupting its normal programmes to bring you an important announcement.
I'm hoping the audible shuffling of paper becomes historically iconic. Similarly, Channel 4 de-Hollyoaksed in mid-sentence to cut to the increasingly unsettling sombre ident, again as deployed with Philip last year.
This is Channel 4. We now join the Channel 4 News.
Good evening. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Queen Elizabeth.
So at least it did come as a news flash for some people. It would be underwhelming if the news had merely broken into more rolling news, which is oddly what it did on Channel 5, who went to their own slightly ramshackle ITN service after ITV, and ended up breaking the news via Dan Walker reading it off his phone.
And as we're watching those gates at Balmoral, we can bring you the breaking news tonight on 5 News. And I'm afraid it is with great sadness that we bring you this news and tell you that Her Majesty the Queen has sadly died. Her family, including Charles and Princess William and Harry, have travelled to Balmoral earlier on today. And in the last few minutes, we have received a statement from Buckingham Palace. And I know that people are joining us all the time, and I know that this news is particularly significant, and I know that it's probably one of those days where many of you watching us tonight will be shaken by what you've heard.
If that was too underwhelming for you, over on Sky, Dermot Murnaghan, only slightly upstaged by his own Chiron, had a minor Walter Cronkite moment.
We have some very important news. Buckingham Palace has just announced that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II has died. She was 96 years old. The Queen died just a few moments ago, the announcements at Balmoral.
And if that was too subdued, whatever idiots actually watch Talk TV would have learned it from an openly weeping Vanessa Feltz.
It is 6:32. The day is the 8th of September 2022. And I'm extremely sorry to have to bring you the exceptionally sad news that Her Majesty the Queen has died. The news has been confirmed by Buckingham Palace. Her Majesty was 96 years old and had reigned for 70 years. News of her passing is reaching the rest of the world, and she was monarch of more than 100 million people. Her reign began on the 6th of February 1952 when she was just 25.
Who was then interrupted in mid-sentence in favour of a more composed Piers Morgan, as if that was any improvement whatsoever.
Well, good evening, I'm Piers Morgan.
Explicit fascist propaganda network GB News probably did something too, but who cares? Best of all though, and I mean that very sincerely, the CBBC channel went to a special news round news flash, gently explaining the situation to the nation's under-11s.
Good afternoon. This is News Round. We have some sad news to bring you today. Queen Elizabeth II has died at the age of 96. She passed away at Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire. She was the UK's longest serving monarch. She spent longer on the throne than any other king or queen.
Which was obviously completely brilliant and exactly the right thing to do. And only the BBC would have done it. And so the world screeched to a halt. The Queen's slow fading over the course of the day and the consequent warning our broadcasters got made it go off all quite tastefully, in general. When Philip had died out of the relative blue, Radio 2 had to interrupt Vanessa Feltz in mid-sentence, which seems to be an important part of the royal protocol.
Or text us on 88299.
This is BBC News. We're interrupting our schedules for the following announcement.
This time, a clearly briefed, eerily solemn Sarah Cox queued up some downbeat Fleetwood Mac, and halfway through it, the world stopped turning.
That was Backstreet Boys and I Want It That Way, and this is Fleetwood Mac and Dreams.
This is BBC News. We're interrupting our schedules for the following announcement. Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
And women, they will come and they will go. Other radio stations dropped out in the middle of carefully chosen sad music.
This is Capital, it's 6:34 and now a special news report.
From Global's newsroom in London.
Sadly, there were no reported sightings of the In the Nursery mix of Haunted Dancehall by Sabres of Paradise, as promised for years. The outlying skerries of television did their bit too. QVC immediately put up the shutters, as has become traditional, and kept them up for the majority of the entire mourning period. The UK TV channels, having little choice, kept up their usual schedules, but temporarily switched to bleak, sombre idents. Or as sombre as possible when your channel is literally called Dave. They also replaced their commercial breaks with a glumly pirouetting logo with ambient music, for as long as they dared. Which wasn't as long as the main commercial channels. ITV and Channel 4 did without advertising entirely for the first couple of days, even for regular programming like Gogglebox. So we settled in for 10 days of mourning, starting from the day after. It was already clear that lessons had been learned from the last time, with Prince Philip's death clearing all the decks for over a week, which turned out to be out of proportion to public grief over the old racist. On that occasion, the BBC channels remained crushed into a single rolling news monolith till late the following day. This time, BBC Two was freed by the 9th of September, running as relatively normal, usually with the most serious idents they could find, acting as a sort of pressure valve, playing host to the likes of Homes Under the Hammer and EastEnders, both to keep the BBC from falling hopelessly behind schedule, and more importantly, keeping viewers from getting fed up with the wall-to-wall grieving. Viewers that weren't could then stay with BBC One, which showed nothing but news interspersed with one-show specials and documentaries for 3 days, with no ident at all. Just this black silk backdrop for programme menus and extraordinarily solemn announcements. Eventually BBC One had to exhale and start having programmes again. And as expected, they broke out the gold leaf motif they'd used a year earlier for Prince Philip, this time in purple and with the royal coat of arms instead of the Hercules and a nappy one used by the late Duke. For some reason, probably completely unrelated to any kind of rational thought process, the purple made it seem more appropriate for a memorial ident than the blue. Even ITV went back to Tipping Point in Emmerdale eventually, albeit without adverts. Channels 4 and 5 went back to normal pretty quickly too. In the former case because they feel in situations like this that it's their duty to provide alternative viewing, and in the latter, probably because no one would have noticed either way. It wasn't as if the grief wasn't greater this time than last. It was. This was and is the end of an epoch. This time around they probably could have gone as over the top as they did for her husband, and maybe even got away with it. But, as I said, lessons had clearly been learned. We were having 10 full days of government-mandated mourning, whether we liked it or not. The coverage couldn't be wall-to-wall on every channel for all of that time. We'd lose our minds. Even the idents weren't entirely restricted. There was a little easier on the eye than the black-on-black one they'd effected for Philip. BBC One used the purple curtain for programming actively related to the dead lady, but otherwise plumbed their usual rotation, albeit only the least exuberant ones from it. So began the oddest week in recent British history. We slowly adjusted to having a king, helped by the deliberate tactic of just throwing it straight in there in the initial announcement.
The King and the Queen Consort.
Nothing like ripping off the band-aid. We watched the Kingman visit all the various nations in Britain in turn, except for one. The news rolled on BBC One and to a lesser extent on ITV. Valuable airtime was filled by repeating basic facts like the viewers were idiots, like that the Queen was now a king, that he was called Charles III, and we had a new national anthem. Except of course that we didn't, if only we had. No, we just updated the nouns and pronouns in the one that we were already using. But it filled time during that period when nothing was actually happening, but everyone still had by law to performatively grieve, if only by just acknowledging how weird everything was. That counts as grieving. The Queen in a box was taken about the place for a while, and we all followed that, and then there was the lying in state, and the news became a set of endless updates about a queue. Sad people queuing, sometimes famous people queuing, and of course both broadcasters had unbroken footage of the end of the queue, at which it turned out all these people had been waiting for the opportunity to walk within about 5 yards of the box, nod, and leave. So they might as well have just watched the rolling coverage of the box and nodded at that. And then finally it was funeral day.
This is BBC One on Monday the 19th of September. Now, the funeral of Her Majesty, the Queen.
Once again the BBC channels joined as one, and ITV provided a solid alternative. Their Dimbleby was younger and stronger. Channel 4 respectfully showed some nice art of landscape wallpaper, followed by some gossamer soft documentaries about the Queen gardening or just pottering around. And as the cortege made its way to Windsor for the committal, the movie of the coronation, narrated by Laurence Olivier. And no adverts all day, just a sad continued shortly slide. Which for people my age was actually quite nostalgic in itself, really. All very respectful, which is more than could be said for Channel 5. They just put out their usual bank holiday milkshake strand of kids shows, Fireman Sam, Thomas the Tank Engine and such, which is fair enough in itself, but that was followed right when the ceremony began with a showing of the Emoji Movie, which I'm pretty certain is tantamount to treason. Still, at least they used their own sombre ident, and even cut to a flag at half-mast at the appropriate juncture, and there were vanishingly few adverts. Not no adverts, but not many. Channel 5 could probably defend themselves, at least if it wasn't a bloody Emoji Movie they put on, by saying that it hardly mattered what they showed. They could have put on a Cannibal Holocaust if they'd wanted, no one was looking. 85% of the country was watching the BBC, 10% was watching ITV, and the remaining 5% refused to be near a screen at all on general principles. I was among the former 85%. Like it or not, this really was huge history happening. Large, even. Ignoring it was impossible. Though there's that 5% who turned their backs, which is incidentally a perfectly valid response, but they were still engaging with it. Rejection is a form of acknowledgement. That's what makes it a massive historical event. Even the people who don't care and don't want to can't ignore it completely. And once she was in the ground, or more accurately on a shelf in a crypt, the world sprang back to normal. Except we have a king now. And William is the Prince of Wales. And hey, you got a Princess of Wales again, that's nice. Missed having one of those. I don't expect things to be all that different without her in the long term, although there is a certain semiotic difference between having a queen and having a king. The word king, or the idea of a king, is just a bit more authoritarian, a bit more spiky, without the sense of maternal comfort that the Queen had, and had for so long that it became part of the fabric of national society. For a full biblical lifespan, 70 years, we had a Queen. She was, as much as anything else, a simple fact. The grass was green, the sky had clouds, and we had the Queen, the matriarch of the country. Now we have to adjust to having a patriarch instead, and that's a whole different relationship. It's going to feel weird saying God save the king for a while, and in a way many people might not have expected. Mind you, people said all this when Victoria died and Edward became king. We got used to it then. I'm sure we will again. First, we've got a nice shiny coronation to look forward to, probably in the late spring or summer. Hopefully, by then, it'll have finally sunk in that the Queen is gone. Because I don't know about you, but I still can't quite comprehend it. There is no Queen. The grass is still green. There's still clouds in the sky. That much is still true.